Welcome to CSS Breakdown, book by book, Season 06, Episode 22, where we delve into Norman Lowe's Mastering Modern British History to explore a conflict that shattered initial expectations and profoundly reshaped a nation, the First World War. You've asked us to deep dive into this pivotal moment, and our mission today is to uncover how a conflict expected to be over in weeks transformed British society, politics, and its place in the world. We'll be pulling key insights directly from Norman Lowe's detailed account.
Yeah, it's really striking, isn't it? That initial belief, the whole over by Christmas idea,
Wow.
how quickly and, well, brutally that was disproven. It set the stage for so much unforeseen change, things we still feel today. So let's unpack that, the initial hopes versus the grim reality that followed.
Absolutely. That optimism, you see it across Britain, even in Germany. People genuinely thought a few weeks, maybe a couple of months, over by Christmas. It wasn't just a hopeful phrase. It was like a core belief for many.
And yet, right at the start, you have Lord Kitchener, newly appointed Secretary for War. He goes to the cabinet and gives this incredibly bleak assessment. He says something like, it'll be nearer 3 years than 3 months. Imagine hearing that when everyone else is so optimistic. Utterly dismaying, but, well, tragically accurate.
And that swift shift from, war of movement, which is what they expected, to this grinding stalemate on the Western Front, that's what really shattered those early hopes. You had these huge alliances forming. The Allies, or Entente powers, Britain and the Empire, France, Russia, later Japan, Italy, the U.S.
Right, and facing them, the Central Powers, mainly Germany and Austria-Hungary, but also Turkey and Bulgaria joining in. A massive lineup on both sides.
And the Germans had this big plan, didn't they? The Schlieffen Plan.
That's right, a real gamble. The idea was a lightning strike through neutral Belgium, knock out France super quickly before Russia could get its massive army fully mobilized. Avoid fighting on two fronts at all costs.
But it didn't work out that way.
No, it famously failed. Partly because Belgian resistance was much stronger than expected. That caused a crucial delay.
And that delay gave the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, just enough time to land in France and get into position.
Exactly. Now, the BEF was small compared to the French and German armies. Only 4 divisions initially, versus 70-odd on each side.
Tiny, relatively speaking.
But it played this really significant role. It helped slow down that German advance towards Paris. The Battle of Mons, for example, the British were there, unexpectedly blocking the German path, fighting back surprisingly effectively.
And then came the Battle of the Marne in September 1914. That was critical.
Absolutely critical. The French, with the BEF playing a valuable supporting role, managed to drive the Germans back. The Marne essentially wrecked the Schlieffen Plan. Germany was now stuck in that two-front war it dreaded. And it marked the end, really, of the War of Movement.
Leading to the trenches.
Precisely. Those infamous lines of trenches starting to snake their way across Europe from the English Channel right down to the Alps.
The First Battle of Ypres, later in 1914, kind of cemented this new reality, didn't it?
It did. A horrifically bloody battle. The British managed to hold Ypres, which was vital for keeping the Channel ports open, but the cost was enormous. Over half the original BEF force wounded, maybe a tenth killed. It basically destroyed that initial professional army. They had to rebuild with new, less experienced recruits.
Which brings us squarely to the problem of stalemate. Why was it so incredibly hard to break through on the Western Front?
Well, several reasons, really. Any big infantry attack was always preceded by these massive artillery bombardments. Days, sometimes weeks of shelling.
So much for surprise.
Exactly. It completely eliminated any element of surprise. Plus, you had reconnaissance aircraft, observation balloons spotting any troop buildups miles away.
And the ground itself.
Oh, the ground was just churned into this impassable mud bath by the shelling. Trying to advance quickly was impossible. And then you faced deadly machine gun fire, often from positions the artillery hadn't even touched.
Plus those horrible salients, the bulges in the line, constantly exposed to fire from multiple directions.
Right. Even new weapons like poison gas were unreliable. The Germans used it at Ypres, but then the wind changed and blew it back on their own troops. It's just a nightmare scenario for any attack.
You can understand Kitchener's frustration. That quote, "I don't know what is to be done. This isn't war." It captures that sense of helplessness.
It really does. And with the Western Front seemingly deadlocked, Allied leaders started desperately looking for alternatives, for a way around the trenches.
Which leads us to Gallipoli.
Yes, the Gallipoli campaign in 1915. Winston Churchill was a major advocate for this. The idea was, let's bypass the Western Front, knock Turkey, seen as the weakest link in the Central Powers, out of the war, and critically, open up a supply route through the Black Sea to struggling Russia.
Seemed logical on paper, maybe. But in reality,
A disaster, a complete failure. The initial naval attack was stopped by Turkish mines. Then the landings, including the famous Anzac Sea troops from Australia and New Zealand, they just got bogged down. Turkish defenses had been reinforced, they held the high ground, the Allies couldn't make any headway, and eventually the whole force had to be
a
evacuated.
massive blow to morale,
A
wasn't it?
huge blow. Lost that chance to help Russia via the Black Sea. It probably pushed Bulgaria into joining the Central Powers too.
Yeah.
And the casualties, horrific. Around 250,000 Allied wounded, tens of thousands killed.
A terrible cost. And then, the very next year, another infamous battle. The Somme.
The Somme, 1916, the big British push on the Western Front that year, partly intended to relieve the immense pressure the French were under at Verdun.
But the first day, July 1st, 1916, it's become synonymous with disaster.
An unmitigated catastrophe. The week-long preliminary bombardment, it just hadn't worked properly. It failed to cut the German barbed wire in many places, didn't destroy the deep German dugouts.
The British troops were ordered to advance.
Yeah. At walking pace, laden with gear. They walked straight into uncut wire and devastating machine gun fire.
The numbers are staggering.
21,000 British soldiers killed on that single day, over 35,000 wounded, with almost nothing to show for it in terms of ground gained. And yet, the commander, Sir Douglas Haig, insisted on continuing the attacks until November.
The overall result.
Minimal gains, a few miles at most in some places, but the cost, appalling. Around 650,000 German casualties, 418,000 British, nearly 200,000 French. Just mind-boggling losses. Now, some argue it did help wear down a German army in the long run. Even German commanders admitted that. But the immediate impact on Britain was shock, grief, and it certainly contributed to the fall of the Prime Minister, Asquith.
It's interesting here, Neil Ferguson raises a really provocative, controversial point in his analysis. He suggests that maybe if Britain hadn't sent the BEF at all.
Yes, the counterfactual.
Right. He argues Germany would likely have won quickly in 1914. And controversially, he speculates a German-dominated Europe might have evolved into something like the EU, maybe without the huge cost to British power, possibly even avoiding communism and the Third Reich later on.
It's a massive what-if. Was Britain's entry, as he puts it, the greatest error of modern history? It certainly makes you think about the long-term consequences of that initial decision to intervene.
A huge question. But dealing with the reality they faced, the war demanded fundamental changes in Britain itself, starting right at the top with leadership.
Definitely. Asquith, the prime minister at the start, he was a capable peacetime leader, but his style, sort of wait and see, his reluctance to really interfere directly, like with the shell shortage crisis early on, it just wasn't suited for total war.
A.J.P. Taylor had that quote, didn't he? Asquith was as solid as a rock, but like a rock, incapable of movement.
That sums it up well. His move to form a coalition government in May 1915, bringing in conservatives and labor, was meant to shore up support, but ironically, it gave a foothold to his main rival.
Lloyd George.
David Lloyd George. He was made Minister of Munitions in that coalition, and he just burst onto the scene as this incredibly dynamic, energetic figure, a complete contrast to Asquith's more detached style.
And he just kept rising.
He did. After Kitchener died, he became Secretary for War, and then in December 1916, after some pretty intense political maneuvering, he effectively forced Asquith to resign and became Prime Minister himself.
A key issue between them was conscription, wasn't it?
Yes, that was a major point of friction. Lloyd George became convinced it was the only way Britain could field the armies needed to win. Asquith, being a traditional liberal, was deeply opposed to compelling men to fight.
But Lloyd George won out.
He did. Conscription for all males aged 18 to 45, later extended to 51, was introduced in May 1916. A huge step, fundamentally changing the relationship between the state and the individual in Britain.
And as the Minister of Munitions, Lloyd George really made his mark, didn't he? The man who got things done.
Absolutely. He cut through red tape, brought in businessmen to run things efficiently, sorted out that shell shortage dramatically. He championed machine guns, apparently telling officials to take Kitchener's estimate, square it, multiply by 2, then double it again.
Probably apocryphal, but it captures his energy.
It does. He backed the Stokes mortar, which commanders initially distrusted, and was an early enthusiast for the tank, ordering the first 40 himself. He also pushed through the Munitions of War Act, giving the government massive control over arms factories, banning strikes.
But conscription itself caused a backlash.
Oh, yes. Significant protests, particularly from conscientious objectors, COs, men who refused to fight on religious or moral grounds. About 4,000 declared themselves COs. Some absolutists refused even non-combatant roles and faced harsh treatment, even death sentences that were later commuted. They got support from groups like the Bloomsbury Intellectuals, Virginia Woolf, Bertrand Russell, who were strongly anti-war.
So Lloyd George takes over as prime minister. How did he run the war effort?
He basically centralized power massively. Historian K.O. Morgan described it as running the country almost like a dictator, something unprecedented in British history.
How so?
He set up a small, powerful war cabinet of just 5 ministers to make quick decisions. He bypassed traditional civil service structures, bringing in outside experts, businessmen, advisors in his private garden suburb secretariat.
And government control extended everywhere.
Pretty much. All merchant shipping was controlled, farmers told what to grow, factories directed on production, the coal industry effectively nationalized. Rationing of key foods came in by 1918. Price controls, wage controls, even restricting pub opening hours and watering down beer.
Some of those pub rules lasted decades.
They did, that afternoon gap. Militarily, he pushed hard for the convoy system against Admiralty reluctance, which proved vital. And he eventually managed to get French Marshal Foch appointed as Supreme Allied Commander, reducing Hague's independent control.
It's fascinating, though. His style, while seemingly effective for the war effort, made him enemies and famously split his own Liberal Party down the middle.
That's the paradox. Many historians argue that Britain probably would have lost the war if Asquith had stayed in charge. Lloyd George's decisiveness, even his ruthless streak, seemed necessary for that moment of crisis. But the political cost, especially for the Liberals, was immense.
Beyond leadership, the war just permeated every aspect of British society. Historians debate the extent, don't they? Marwick seeing profound change, Pew arguing more for acceleration of existing trends.
Yes, there's that ongoing debate. But undeniably, the political landscape shifted dramatically. The Liberal Party, already facing challenges, went into this disastrous decline because of the war strains, and that Lloyd George Asquith split. You saw that clearly in the Maurice debate late in the war.
And who benefited?
Labour, certainly in the long run. They gained valuable experience in coalition government, but also asserted their independence from the Liberals. Their 1918 manifesto, Labour and the New Social Order, was quite radical, calling for nationalization, a minimum wage, social services.
And the Conservatives?
The Conservatives arguably benefited most immediately. They were back in government through the coalition, the Liberals were fractured, and they became the dominant party in British politics for much of the next, 30 years or so.
And government intervention wasn't just political, it was personal. Conscription hitting almost every family.
Absolutely. Trade unions actually grew in strength and reputation, despite strikes being officially banned, though some did happen. Rationing, price controls, those pub rules we mentioned. The state was suddenly involved in daily life like never before.
One of the biggest societal shifts always discussed is the impact on women.
Right. With millions of men away fighting, women stepped into roles they'd never occupied before. Munitions factories, the munitionettes, but also farming, transport, policing, banking, clerical work, even heavy industry.
Vera Britton's Testament of Youth gives such a powerful account of nursing experiences.
It does. Women proved they could do these jobs, which undoubtedly boosted their confidence and challenged pre-war ideas about their capabilities.
But there's a counter-argument too, isn't there? That the change wasn't as revolutionary as sometimes portrayed.
Yes. Historians like de Groot and Pew offer that caution. Women were almost always paid less than men for the same work. Most were expected to, and did, give up their jobs when the men returned. So while it was a significant step, genuine equality was still a long way off. It wasn't an immediate transformation.
Still, the war undeniably accelerated the move towards democracy.
Hugely. Britain in 1914 wasn't fully democratic, no women voters, and about 40% of men still couldn't vote. The Representation of the People Act in 1918 changed that dramatically. It gave the vote to all men over 21 and, crucially, to women over 30, largely acknowledging the massive contribution both soldiers and women workers had made to the war effort.
What about other long-term impacts?
Well, education saw the 1918 Fisher Act, aiming to improve schooling for the working class. Housing was transformed, building stopped during the war, creating a huge shortage, leading to Lloyd George's promise of homes fit for heroes and the rise of council housing afterwards.
And technology.
Big stimulus for aviation, leading to commercial flights soon after the war, and also broadcasting, with the BBC formed just a few years later.
But looming over all of this is the sheer human cost.
Absolutely devastating. Around 745,000 British men killed, another 1.6 million wounded, many with life-changing injuries. The lost generation. You think of the sheer number of families receiving those dreaded telegrams. Writers like Robert Graves captured the horror so vividly.
And the economic impact. Britain came out victorious, but weakened.
Significantly weakened, lost about 40% of its merchant shipping to U-boats, piled up enormous debts, especially to the United States, lost vital overseas export markets during the war, which competitors snapped up. All this contributed to Britain's relative economic decline and the high unemployment seen between the wars.
Did the war affect different social classes differently economically?
Yes, quite markedly, according to Lowe's. Increased taxes, especially death duties, hit the aristocracy hard, forcing many to sell off land and estates. The middle classes often struggled with inflation and falling living standards.
The working class.
Generally, they saw improvements. Government intervention meant wage rates often doubled. Working hours were sometimes reduced. Rationing, ironically, meant some poor families could afford things like meat regularly for the first time because prices were controlled and supply, while limited, was more evenly distributed. Marwick's summary is neat. The working class in 1914 was large and it was poor. In the early 1920s, it was not quite so large and it was not quite so poor.
And attitudes changed too. Less deference.
Definitely. A marked decline in respect for authority, especially among men who'd served and seen the perceived incompetence of some generals firsthand. And a noticeable drop in church attendance, too, partly a reaction against the Church of England's strong support for the war effort.
So, while the home front was being transformed, how was the actual fighting evolving towards the end? Let's talk about the war at sea.
Right. Public expectation was for big, decisive naval battles like Trafalgar. But reality was more cautious. Admiral Jellicoe, commanding the British fleet, knew he was, as Churchill said, the only man who could have lost the war in an afternoon. Germany's fleet was smaller, so they were cautious too.
So, the main naval action was?
The Allied blockade, hugely effective, slowly strangling the Central Powers by cutting off trade and supplies, while generally keeping Allied sea lanes open. There were some surface actions early on, like the Battle of the Falkland Islands, which destroyed a German squadron.
But the Germans hit back with submarines.
Mines and U-boats, yes. The sinking of the passenger liner Lusitania in 1915, with many Americans on board, caused a major diplomatic row with the U.S., but didn't bring them into the war just yet.
And the one big fleet battle was Jutland.
Jutland, May 1916. The only major clash between the main fleets. Tactically, it was kind of indecisive. The British lost more ships and men, but strategically, it was a British win. The German fleet failed to break British dominance and basically stayed in port for the rest of the war, realizing they couldn't win a surface fight, which led them to double down on
unrestricted submarine warfare.
Exactly. In January 1917, Germany declared they'd sink any ship, enemy or neutral, approaching Allied ports. A massive gamble to starve Britain into submission before the U.S. could effectively intervene if they chose to enter the war.
And it nearly worked, didn't it?
It came terrifyingly close. By April 1917, Britain was reportedly down to 6 weeks' worth of corn. U-boats were sinking ships faster than they could be built. 430 ships lost in that 1 month alone. It was desperate.
And here's where Lloyd George's intervention was crucial again.
Absolutely. Against strong resistance from the Admiralty, he insisted on implementing the convoy system, grouping merchant ships together with warship escorts.
And it worked.
Dramatically. Losses plummeted almost immediately. The convoy system essentially defeated the U-boat gamble. And this, combined with outrage over the Zimmermann telegram where Germany tried to entice Mexico into attacking the U.S., that was the final straw that brought the United States into the war in April 1917, a truly pivotal moment.
So America's in, the U-boat threat is contained, but peace was still elusive.
Very much so. Despite the horrific slaughter, attempts at a negotiated peace in 1917 failed. Both sides, deep down, still thought they could win outright and weren't willing to make the necessary compromises. In Germany, the military leadership under Hindenburg and Ludendorff effectively took control and were determined to fight for total victory. In Britain, Lloyd George remained committed to a knockout blow. Even efforts by the U.S., Russia, the Pope, all rejected.
But there were Allied successes on the ground in 1917.
Some important ones. The Canadians captured Vimy Ridge, a huge tactical victory. The Battle of Cambrai showed, for the first time really, that tanks used en masse could actually break through trench lines, even if the gains weren't held. Haig and the British command were starting to learn adept tactics.
But then the blow of Russia leaving the war.
A huge blow, yes. December 1917. Defeats and revolution forced Russia out. That freed up hundreds of thousands of German troops to move from the Eastern Front to the West, a potential game-changer for Germany.
Though elsewhere, things were going better for the Allies. Against the Turks.
Yes, significant progress there. British forces, often including troops from India, Australia, and New Zealand, captured Kut, Baghdad. The Arab Revolt, famously supported by T.E. Lawrence, tied down Turkish forces. Aqaba, Jerusalem, eventually Damascus fell. Turkey signed an armistice in October 1918.
And the American impact on the Western Front.
Immense. It wasn't just the troops, though eventually over 500,000 were fighting by mid-1918. It was the supplies, food, ships, credit, and the psychological impact. A massive boost to Allied morale, a corresponding crushing blow to German morale, seeing this endless wave of fresh American soldiers arriving. This all leads up to Germany's final, desperate gamble in the spring of 1918.
The Ludendorff Offensive, or Spring Offensive.
Right. Ludendorff threw everything, including those troops freed from Russia, into a massive attack on the Somme front, trying to break through and win before the Americans arrived in overwhelming numbers.
And they nearly succeeded again.
They did. They punched a huge hole in the Allied lines, advanced nearly 40 miles at one point, the closest they'd been to Paris since 1914. It looks like the Allies might actually crumble, but they held on, crucially appointing French Marshal Foch as the supreme Allied commander to coordinate the defense.
And then the tide turned for good.
Yes. The Allied counteroffensive began in August 1918. Foch directed a series of coordinated attacks. Haig, using those newly refined tactics, shorter bombardments, hundreds of tanks, surprise achieved major breakthroughs. The Germans were steadily pushed back, forced out of the Hindenburg Line, their main defensive system. By late September, Ludendorff himself told the Kaiser the war was lost and they needed to seek an armistice.
Which was finally signed on November 11th, 1918. So looking back, why did the Allies ultimately win?
It was a combination of factors, really. You start with the failure of the Schlieffen Plan. Germany just wasn't equipped for the long two-front war it ended up fighting.
Allied sea power was huge.
Absolutely critical. That blockade slowly starved Germany while keeping the Allies supplied, and the eventual defeat of the U-boat campaign, thanks to convoys and U.S. help, was vital.
And the U.S. entry itself.
Indispensable. The sheer weight of American men and resources tipped the balance decisively. Leadership arguably played a part too. Lloyd George and Francis Clemenceau were seen as more effective war leaders by that stage, and that unity of command under Foch in 1918 really helped coordinate the final push.
What about the British High Command? That whole lions led by donkeys idea.
The eternal debate about Haig and the generals. Were they incompetent butchers and bunglers responsible for senseless slaughter, or did they face an unprecedented challenge and learn, adapt, and ultimately mastermind the 1918 victories?
Lowe presents both sides.
He does. Some defend Haig, pointing to his eventual success and the complexities of coalition warfare. Others, like Ferguson, still emphasize the catastrophic mistakes, like the Somme Plan, the initial dismissal of tanks. It highlights just how difficult it is to judge leadership in such extreme, novel circumstances.
And ultimately, Germany itself was just exhausted.
Completely exhausted. Years of horrific losses, dwindling manpower. They were using teenagers by 1918. The Spanish flu epidemic hit them hard too. Morale collapsed, and Germany was constantly having to prop up its failing allies, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria.
Once those allies started collapsing in late 1918.
That signaled the end was near. Bulgaria, then Turkey, then Austria-Hungary sued for peace. That combination of military defeat, food shortages, utter war weariness finally led to mutiny in the German Navy, spreading to the army and sparking revolution at home. The Kaiser abdicated just days before the armistice.
So the war ends, then comes the challenge of making peace. The Versailles Conference.
January 1919, the Big Three dominated. Lloyd George for Britain, Clemenceau for France, Woodrow Wilson for the USA, and they all came with very different, often conflicting aims.
Britain's position was complicated.
A bit. Publicly, Lloyd George had fought an election on slogans like, "Make Germany pay." But privately, he and advisors like Keynes worried that crippling Germany too much would just breed resentment and hurt future trade. He aimed for a kind of balance.
France wanted
Revenge, essentially, and security. Clemenceau wanted Germany punished severely, stripped of territory and military power, perhaps even broken up, to ensure it could never threaten France again.
And Wilson.
Wilson came with his idealistic 14 points principles like national self-determination, open diplomacy, and crucially, the establishment of a League of Nations to prevent future wars. A very different vision from Clemenceau's.
The resulting Treaty of Versailles with Germany reflected these clashes. What were the key terms?
Significant territorial losses for Germany. Alsace-Lorraine back to France, areas to Belgium, Denmark, Poland. Danzig became a free city. German colonies were taken away, becoming mandates under League supervision, mostly run by Britain and France.
And military restrictions.
Severe. Army limited to 100,000 men, no conscription, no tanks, no air force, no submarines, only a tiny navy. The Rhineland bordering France was to be permanently demilitarized.
And the really controversial parts.
Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, which forced Germany to accept sole blame for starting the war, deeply resented in Germany, and reparations financial payments for war damage. The final figure was set at a massive $6.6 billion, which economists like Keynes argued was far too high and counterproductive.
Plus, the League of Nations was set up.
Yes, Wilson's big project intended to provide collective security and resolve disputes peacefully. Treaties with Germany's allies followed, dismantling the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires, creating new nations like Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia.
So the big question lingers. Was the peace settlement too harsh on Germany?
Germans certainly thought so. They rejected the War Guilt Clause, felt betrayed because they believed the armistice was based on Wilson's more lenient 14 points, and argued they hadn't really been defeated militarily since Germany itself wasn't invaded.
And even some on the Allied side had doubts.
Many felt the terms, especially reparations, were punitive and unrealistic, potentially sowing the seeds for future conflict. But the counterargument is that the territorial losses were mostly in non-German areas, and Germany, despite the treaty, remained potentially the strongest single power on the continent.
It was a messy compromise, wasn't it? And it had major flaws from the start.
Crucially, the U.S. Senate refused to ratify the treaty, so the U.S. never joined the League of Nations, Wilson's own creation. This massively weakened the League from day one and left France feeling abandoned and insecure. Other allies felt cheated too.
Leading to a very fragile peace.
Exactly. As historian Ruth Hennig suggests, while the treaty itself might have created bitterness, the real failure was perhaps the lack of cooperation afterwards between Britain, France, and the U.S. to actually enforce the settlement and manage European security together. That failure, she argues, was a key factor contributing to the outbreak of another world war just 20 years later. The peace was flawed, yes, but the failure to uphold even that flawed peace proved catastrophic.
We started this deep dive into Norman Lowe's Mastering Modern British History with a picture of a nation that, like many others, optimistically believed the First World War would be over by Christmas. What we've unpacked today is the incredible and often brutal journey from that naive hope to a 4-year global catastrophe that profoundly reshaped Britain from top to bottom.
Yeah, from that initial shock of stalemate and the sheer horror of battles like the Somme and Passchendaele to the really radical changes in government power, the role of technology like tanks and convoys, and those huge societal shifts, politics, women's roles, class structures, the war just altered the very fabric of British life.
The First World War didn't just redefine warfare, it redefined nations. It redefined the relationship between citizens and the state, leaving this incredibly complex legacy far beyond the battlefields. So for you, our curious learner, thinking about today, what surprising long-term consequences might seemingly short-term crises hold? Much like those unforeseen ripple effects of the First World War, what might we be underestimating now? Something to think about until our next deep dive.